right, you'll notice that I have a question on the board. Question is, what are the Gospels? Now, it may seem strange because you might be used to hearing the question, what is the Gospel? We're not there yet. That's another lesson. We're going to get into what is the Gospel later. What we're going to do, what I want now is as we are moving into the New Testament, we're going to hit the first 4 books. First 4 books are
Matthew, Mark, Luke,
John.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What are they? What are they called?
Apostles.
The what?
Gospels.
The Gospels. Those are the Gospel books, the 4 Gospel books. We have 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I wanted to ask you, what are the Gospels? What are these 4 books? What is it all about? So I'm asking. This is going to be a very study, hopefully interactive lesson. This is not going to be just me teaching. I want to get back from you. I want to know what you know, because it will help me know where we're going to go in the future as far as lessons go. So, my question to you is, what are the Gospels? If you had to complete the sentence, the Gospels are, what are they?
Records by people that walked and talked and knew Jesus.
Records about Jesus that from people who walked and talked and knew Jesus.
Yes.
Okay. What else?
I was just going to say the life of Jesus.
The life of Jesus. So the Gospels are the life of Jesus, right?
How each one's seen it.
How each one's seen it. Okay, that's very good. Very good. What about you? What do you think the Gospels are? What are the Gospels?
I think the Gospels are people who know God and preach to other people who do not know God.
Okay, so the Gospel is from people who know God, about God, to people that don't know God. Okay? What do you think? What are Gospels? Either of you two are more than welcome.
Personal account of 4 of Jesus's chosen apostles that give a record of Jesus's life as they interpreted it.
Okay, there was a lot in that, but it basically was the interpretation of the life of Christ as seen or perceived through chosen apostles, whatever, of Jesus Christ, and explaining his life and what's going on.
And it's also God's word.
And it's also God's word. Okay.
It does beg a question. Wouldn't one account have been enough if it was thorough?
That's another good question. It goes back to what are the differences between them. There must be differences, otherwise one gospel account would have been enough. Right?
Right.
Okay, I would like to give you a working definition. I would like to really focus on this because as we're going through this, you have to keep this in mind of what it is that we're reading when we go through the Gospels. Okay? First, we got to understand what gospel means. So, gospel, what does gospel mean? What does gospel mean? What does the word mean?
Good news.
Holy men.
No, not holy men.
Good news.
Good news. So, if you were to complete the sentence, the Gospels are, you would start with an announcement or the announcement, proclamation, the telling of good news. That's first. So the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the proclamation, announcement, or telling of good news. That's what gospel means, is good news, good story, good announcement.
But isn't the whole Bible?
It could be. It could be. The good news is in the whole Bible. It encompasses the whole Bible. I think that's one of the faults, one of the failings that we have in many church or in many teachings is that we fail to understand that the gospel doesn't begin with Matthew, but that it goes before even the Genesis. right? We already learned that, right? So the Gospels are the announcement, proclamation, or telling, the good news, the joyful announcement of what? Of what?
Of
The
righteousness?
fulfillment of the Old Testament.
Fulfillment of the, more than just fulfillment of the Old Testament.
Of righteousness?
Of Jesus. Well, no, close. You're jumping one ahead on me on that one.
Of righteousness?
Of righteousness. Righteousness is involved, but not exactly. What do we start from the beginning? What have we been watching the whole time?
How God wants to redeem us.
God's plan of redemption. God's plan. We started with God's plan. The whole thing's been about God's plan from the beginning, right? Okay, so the Gospels are the announcement, proclamation, or telling of good news of God's plan for redemption. Now, where do we get that? What's John 3:16?
For God so loved the world.
Okay, stop right there. Where does that begin? For God, right? There's the beginning of your gospel. It's a proclamation, it's an announcement, it's a telling of good news of God's plan. So first and foremost, when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, understand it's not primarily about a biography about Jesus' life. That's not its purpose. Its purpose is to declare, announce, proclaim the telling of the good news of God's plan. Of God's plan. What did we see in the Old Testament? We saw God's plan of redemption related to humanity, to people, right? His ultimate purpose in that plan was to what?
Redeemer.
That was to the end of the goal. What was the final goal? The ultimate goal, the highest goal of all things ever is to
Glorify the Father.
glorify God, right? Didn't he say, I will make a name for myself?
Yes.
You will know that I am God. They will know that I am God. That is his whole purpose. His whole purpose is to bring glory to himself. He is the highest, most perfect thing for which anything can give glory to. You can't give glory to anything higher. He cannot give glory to someone else.
It is so we know him.
Yes. And he is glorified. Our reaction, the creature's reaction is, you're wonderful. You are awesome. That is the response. So God's plan his ultimate purpose was to bring glory to himself. He communicated, demonstrated, worked that out through people, specially appointed people in the Old Testament. People, kings, priests, prophets, the sacrifices, the law. What else?
His chosen people.
Chosen people,
Through angels.
angels. He communicated this through various different means, right?
He used even rivers and seas and all the...
And his work, what he did through his work, his own personal intervention, his own personal revelation. Yes, exactly. So, what do we got so far? The Gospels are good news announcements, proclamations, and tellings of God's continued plan of redemption, communicated, demonstrated, worked out through, when you get to the New Testament, through whom?
Jesus.
Through the eternal Son of God, the one and only of the Father, Jesus the Christ. That's where you get. So you have two parts. You have the Gospels are the proclamation of God's plan, the good news of God's plan of redemption to the world, to bring glory to himself through the person and work of Jesus Christ, his only begotten Son. That is what you read of in the Gospels. So when you go to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that's what you're going to see. So when you say, okay, wouldn't one gospel record be enough?
Yeah.
The answer would be, if it was just the life of Jesus, that's all you're going to do. You're going to do a biography of Jesus' life. Then yes, perhaps one record would be enough. This is where he's born, this is what he did, this is what is going on, etc., and this is how he lived his life, this is what he said, this is what he did. Yes, ma'am.
I was going through that question in my mind, trying to find a spiritual, scriptural answer to that question about why 4. But isn't there another scripture about if there are 2 or 3 or 4 witnesses? I mean, I can't place it. If I had my concordance, I would. That makes it sure. And if
Yes.
there are, so here we have 4 witnesses of the same event or events.
Yes, exactly. You do have 4 different proclamations, announcements, telling of the story of God's plan of redemption, that good news, through the life, the work, the person of Jesus Christ, his Son. That's what you have in the 4 Gospels. Well, if that is true, then do I tell you how it applies to you if you're a Roman soldier living in Rome someplace? You're a centurion, you're on some guard. Does it come to you in exactly the same words as it would come to a Pharisee who's living in Jerusalem and really hasn't got it yet, maybe kind of sort of like a Nicodemus? Does a Nicodemus get that story, that telling, the same way that the Roman centurion would get it? No, it doesn't. So the audiences change how the proclamation is worded. What needs to go to this one? This person needs to know this about the gospel message. He needs to know about this part of God's plan and what Jesus did to fulfill that part of the plan. But this person over here may be more Jewish focused. He may be more Old Testament focused. The Roman soldier may know nothing of Moses and things like that. The Jewish guy over here may know a lot. He may have lived in that society. He knows the prophecies that the Messiah has to answer. So in order for him to understand the good news, he's got to be convinced that this Jesus is the Messiah, the fulfillment of all those Old Testament prophecies. So the proclamation, the good news, God's plan is the same plan through Jesus Christ. That doesn't change. That's the gospel. That hasn't changed. But how I tell you the gospel may be different than how I tell you the gospel. It doesn't mean that the gospel that I tell you is any different than the gospel that I tell you. It doesn't contradict it. It just means that how I communicate it to you and what's important to you in your life, your understanding where you are, may be completely different than what I have for you. But if you take all 4 and you put them together, you have a really good understanding of this gospel proclamation. Yes, ma'am?
Can I just add, is it the same way how the preacher actually prepares the message to his flock, not general message to some flock, but to his flock, addressing the issues of the flock, or,
Absolutely, absolutely. The idea that the pastor has some truth, some teaching, some information, some encouragement, some edification, some rebuke, some correction, some encouragement, whatever, to give to his flock that he's in charge of, has to be addressed to those people. It needs to go to them. It doesn't need to go to the world in general, although there may be some instances where he may be in that circumstance. But generally speaking, Sunday mornings, whatever you want to call them, he's speaking to a specific audience and needs to speak to that audience, not to them out there, but to the people that God has placed under his care and under his teaching. That's important. So yes, that is true. And it's much the same way. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all have someone that they're teaching. Now, Peter said that these are 4 men chosen by God, apostles. Someone else said walked and talked with, or they knew Jesus. Now, we know 2. That's absolutely true. Matthew and John. But Mark, who's Mark? Who's Mark?
Mark was
His real name, his full name is John Mark.
was Paul, or was
Huh?
Mark was with Paul?
Yes, he was with Paul. You remember in Acts? the Apostle Paul goes out on his missionary journey, and Mark, John Mark, Barnabas's cousin, says, I've had it with this. This is too hard, too whatever. And he splits. He deserts Paul while Paul's being persecuted. And so Paul says, no more. I'm not going out with Mark ever again. Never, never, never. And Barnabas and Paul get into this big, long fight, an argument over whether or not they should go. Barnabas all, please be merciful. And Paul's all, no, 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 no. Back and forth, back and forth. Like, well, at the end of Paul's ministry, he says, bring John Mark. Send John Mark to me. He's good for my soul. He's good for healing. So there was reconciliation eventually, but yes, that is who it was. John Mark hung out with Peter. He was Peter's attachment. So Mark, the Gospel of Mark, was more than likely, the early church leaders said that Mark may not have ever met Jesus. Physically, he may never have met him. He may have, but we don't know. But he definitely was not one of the 12 disciples, and he wasn't an apostle afterwards. But he did hang out with the Apostle Peter. And so the early church fathers said that Peter taught him, and John Mark wrote everything down. So his gospel probably came from all of the teachings and learning that he got from the Apostle Peter. Okay? Luke. Who's Luke?
Doctor.
He was a doctor, physician, not in the sense that we know doctors and physicians, old school physician. Was he a Jew?
Yeah.
No.
No?
Gentile. He's one of the in fact, I think he is the only Gentile that ever wrote a book in the Bible. If I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong, but I think that's true. So he's a Gentile. He's a Gentile physician and historian. So he was very meticulous in his recordings and writings. So when we get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we are looking for God's plan. Primarily, number one, what is God's plan and how is it being revealed or worked out through the person of Jesus Christ, his only begotten Son? It is not a biography. It is not exhaustive, meaning they don't give every little itty-bitty detail. Most of the gospel writers spend more time on the final week or so of his life, when the time of the cross, the Passion Week. There's nothing written about him from about the ages of about 12 till the time he starts his ministry, which is what, 15, 20 years? 15, 16, 17, 18 some odd years. So that whole adolescent, early 20s years, there's nothing that says anything about that in the Bible. It's not important, apparently. So you have the birth, you have the nativity, all that stuff going on. You have his, in the temple, about age 12 or so, talking with the priests, teaching the priests. Then there's nothing more. He grows in wisdom. And then you have, next thing is his baptism with John the Baptist. And he goes out and he starts his ministry. So you don't get his life story. It's not a biography of his life. It's a demonstration, a telling of God's plan revealed through the work and person of Jesus Christ. From 4 different perspectives to 4 various different audiences for 4 very different reasons. Okay? Matthew does not write to the same audience for the same reason that Mark writes, or Luke writes, or John writes. They write for different purposes. Okay, now that we got that, we're good?
Are we going to go over those purposes?
Yes, we will.
Good.
So, we're gonna how would you break down the New Testament? If you had to break down the whole New Testament, how would you break it down? We already said the first part. The first part's the Gospels.
Letters?
Letters is one. You have the Pauline or Paul letters, and then you have the general letters, like from Peter and Jude and things like that. But what's in between there? What's in between the Gospels and the letters? Acts. Acts would be another section of the New Testament. So you have the Gospels, you have Acts, you have the letters, and then what's the last one?
Revelation.
What is Revelation?
End time prophecy.
End time prophecy, yes, but it's also present time because you have the beginning part was the 7 churches. Remember?
Yeah.
And that was at that time. So it is a letter. Who wrote the letter?
John. Uh-oh.
What letter?
Who wrote the letter in Revelation?
Oh, Jesus wrote to the...
Jesus wrote the letter in Revelation. Jesus writes the letter and dictates it to John, tells John, write this down. This is what's going to happen. So Jesus reveals, this is the letter from Jesus revealed to John and all the saints, is Revelation. So even though it is a letter, it's a very special letter. It's a different letter. So you have four sections of New Testament. You got the Gospels, you got the Acts of the Apostles, you got the letters, Pauline and general, and then you have that Revelation, the final Revelation. That's the New Testament. We're going to focus for a while on the Gospels. We're going to look in the Gospels. I want to make sure we get this gospel right. Okay? Because many times through the letters and the rest of the New Testament, the biggest problem that we see is that they don't get the gospel right. They're constantly coming back and saying, anybody who is a false teacher, anybody who's a false prophet, anybody who tells you that Jesus is doing this, this, and this, or anybody who tells you that what we said is not true. They try to go over and debunk Paul. Remember when they tried to go over and debunk Paul? Debunk Paul. He's not an apostle. He's nobody. He's no big deal. What he said is not true. The Judaizers come up and they tell you, oh no, the way Paul and all the other apostles told you how to be saved and what you're supposed to do, that's wrong. You got to be circumcised and you got to do this and you got to do this law and that law. All this sort of stuff was added to it. And then Paul gets to a place where he says, anybody who comes with a different gospel than the one that I've delivered, than the one that we've delivered, the apostles delivered, is anathema. It is an abomination, hated by God, spews, it's disgusting to God. It's hated by God. These people have nothing to do with them. A lot of you get into Jude, you get into the letters from John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, a lot Jude. A lot of it deals with these false teachers bringing a different doctrine, different gospel. So I would like to make sure we get it right. So you come to Matthew, and Matthew you'll find, and I don't know if you want to take notes on this or not, but Matthew is a gospel. Who was Matthew?
Tax collector.
He was a tax collector. Was he one of the disciples or he was one of the extras after the disciples?
He was one of the disciples.
He was one of the disciples. So here's an eyewitness, walked, talked, lived with Jesus. He's a tax collector. He's Jewish. What is his theme? What is his main focus, do you think? Look at Matthew chapter 2. Not the deity of Jesus, not the deity of creature.
Messiahship?
The Messiahship. When you say the Messiahship, what do you mean?
The one prophesied?
Anointed one.
The anointed one. There you go. That's better. The anointed one and Messiah and Christ all mean the same thing. Anointed one, Messiah, Christ, same words, same meaning. What is meant is look in chapter 2 of Matthew and someone read verses 1 and 2. Who can get me verses 1 and 2? Phyllis, can you give me 1 and 2?
After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him."
Very good. The story of the Magi is only in Matthew. It's not in Luke's telling of the story. What do you think Matthew's focus is if he includes the story of the Magi? Not only is it just 1 or 2 paragraphs, it's a good long story. What do you think his purpose would be?
Well, they say to worship him, to worship this little baby that was born as a king.
There you go. Where is the one born King of the Jews? Matthew's theme, his focus, is to prove that Jesus is the King of the Jews, the Messiah, the anointed one that David wrote about in Psalm chapter 2, or the second Psalm. Do you remember the second Psalm? Psalm chapter 2. Psalm chapter 2. Psalm chapter 2 says, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains," they say, "and throw off their fetters. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill." Who's that?
Jesus.
Jesus, my king on Zion. Where's Zion?
The mount.
Jerusalem.
It's the Mount of Jerusalem. It's the mount that Jerusalem's on. So, Matthew's whole point, his whole thrust, is on the kingship of Christ. That he satisfies the kingly prophecies and covenants made through David. Remember that? Way back when. There's a lot of Jewish references back there. 129 Old Testament references in the book of Matthew. Who do you think his audience is? Roman soldiers living in Rome?
No.
No. Who? Jews. That's his point. His point is he's going to write to Jews to convince them. It's an apologetic. It's a I'm going to try to evangelize you. This is who Jesus was and is today. And so he's going to prove the kingship. So for Matthew, it's very important that it's Jesus as king. And you'll hear lots of the kingdom of heaven. You'll hear a lot of the kingdom language in the book of Matthew. Flip over to Mark real quickly. Mark chapter 8. It's on page 1567 in our black Bibles. Mark's a little bit different. Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. It is very fast-paced. There are almost no sermons of Jesus in Matthew. He goes from one miracle to the next miracle to the next miracle to the next miracle. It is highlighted by the word "and immediately" or "then Jesus." It's very, 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 very fast-paced. Chapter 8, starting in verse 31, let's just for time's sake, let's just do verses 31 and 32. Mom, could you read verses 31 and 32?
He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him.
Very good. And we find out later that that was the very well-known, familiar time when Peter says, "You can't do that. There's no way I will ever let them do that." And he says, "You don't understand. Get thee behind me." Right? So what do we have in this part? What is the flavor of these verses? What is the focus? What does Mark focus on concerning Jesus?
Son of Man.
That he's the Son of Man, that must do what?
He will be killed.
He'll be killed.
After 3 days, he will rise again.
What's in verse 31? The very first part of 31.
Began to teach.
He began to suffer. There you go. That's the word. The Son of Man must suffer. That is what you're going to find in Mark. Mark is focused on the suffering, work, servanthood, his giving of his life, his serving of the people, that's Mark's focus and his gospel, is that Jesus did not come to be served, but he came to serve. It's a very servant focused, work focused. He did miracles. He raised the dead. He healed the blind. He fed the sick, or fed the hungry. He came and he gave 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 and he suffered. So you'll hear the theme of the suffering servant in this one. And as I said, there's almost no sermons. It's mostly just miracles. You may not know this from Mark, but he was mostly to Gentile Christians, Gentiles and Gentile Christians. Some of his, if you read it, you'll find that some of his words he translates, because he's writing in Aramaic, and that's the Jewish language. So he'll use the Jewish word, and they say, and then he'll explain it, and you'll find that in his gospel. So he's probably writing to people who don't speak Aramaic or speak very little Aramaic, which would tend to make us think that he's probably writing to Gentiles. Okay? Some people think he was writing to the Gentiles in Rome. Because mind you, as the Gospels are being written, Rome is going bananas. You have Caligula. How many people heard the word Caligula? You know that sick pervert
Yes.
Roman emperor? It was sick. That man was just the most disgusting, nastiest human being. Just anything sexual he did. And it didn't make any difference, and he just used people like nothing. And then Claudius came along. He was not much better. And then Nero. How many people have ever heard that name? Emperor Nero. What was that?
Played his fiddle while we're on bird.
Yeah. Under Nero, which is about, he came to power about 55 AD, about 25 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. He came under, and there was the great persecution, and the destruction of Jerusalem was under him. So Christians and people got really heavily hurt during that time. And this is about the time that the Gospels are being written. Gospels are not being written during Jesus' lifetime. When Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are writing, Jesus has been here, done his life, did his work, went to the cross, was buried, went into the grave, came back out, raised again, saw everybody. He's gone. He's in heaven now. And they're writing back during a time of turmoil. So you got to understand that's another element that we see when we get to the Gospels, is that there's this element of persecution now. Then you get to Luke. Chapter 4 of Luke. It's on page 1596. And we're starting in verse 16, and I'll read it this time. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. And he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened to him, and he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All right. Now, Luke points out this particular prophecy from Isaiah. What do you think is the flavor of Luke's focus based on this particular prophecy that Jesus is used or claims? Look at the prophecy. Look at the prophecy.
I'm the Christ.
No.
He said,
Well,
anointed. I'm the
God has anointed me for a purpose.
to preach good news to the poor.
To the poor. Next line.
He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners
For the prisoners. Next line.
and recovery of sight for the blind.
For the blind. What's the next line?
Suffering.
Huh?
Release
People
the
suffering.
The oppressed. So the poor, the prisoners, the blind, and the oppressed. Who do you think Luke's focus is? Where does his hope go to? His proclamation is going to what kind of people?
Suffering.
Suffering, blind, prisoners, oppressed. How many times do we hear about Gentiles coming to Jesus and getting a miracle? Women coming and talking to Jesus and getting something from Jesus. Poor people, blind, lame, lepers. This is Luke's flavor. His theme, his focus, his audience are the poor, the oppressed, the miserable. The ones that were not in the upper echelons, not the high-powered people. We're talking the common, everyday type of person. He has one of the most detailed descriptions of the nativity of a poor woman, poor virgin young maiden, who travels all this way, gives birth to the Messiah in a manger, in a barn. I mean, we're talking humility, the lowest people to have no room in the inn. All that we find. Who did the angels go to, according to Luke? They were in the fields. Shepherds. Shepherds were the scum of the earth. They were the lowest category of people in that day and age. They were stinky, smelly, gross, hardcore people. They lived in the fields. They smelled like the fields. They smelled like the animals that they attended or tended. So Luke focuses on the lost, the maimed, the what we would call the loser. They're a loser, they're out there, they have no hope, and he brought hope. So his gospel is filled with a joyful announcement to the broken, to the poor, to those who are the misfits of the world. That's who Luke writes to. And it's a wonderful gospel to look at it from that perspective and to go through it. Now those three, Matthew, Mark, Luke, those three are called synoptic gospels. Synoptic meaning vision or sight, syn meaning same, or similar. So those three go with the same look, the same perspective, and you'll find that they're very similar in their history, in their what happened to Jesus' life or through Jesus' life. John, on the other hand, is the odd one. He's the one that's completely off. How many people have read all of John? It's the one that everybody usually goes to. When you've never read the Bible, don't know anything about Jesus, you go to John. You send them to John. Go read John. Yeah. Right? You've read all of it, right? Okay. Does it sound like a nice biographical account, nice chronology of Jesus and where he was born and where did he go and who did he see? Does it sound that way, or is there some confusion there at times? Have you noticed that it doesn't follow the other three?
It seems deeper. More God-focused?
I'm glad that you're saying that. More deeper, more God-focused. The early church fathers, like in the first or second century, who actually knew John, were discipled by John. They said that he wrote this, and they called it a spiritual gospel because it's so heavenly minded. It was meant to be a complement to the other three. The other three had already been written. So more than likely, John's gospel is written about in the 80s and the 90s. This is after the first persecution. John's an old man. Probably about 50 years after Jesus was raised from the dead and went to heaven. Peter, Paul, they've already been martyred. They've already been killed. Matthew may not be around anymore. James had already been killed. James, the brother, another one had been killed. Most of everybody had been gone. So John, this old man, after the first great persecution, moving now into the second great persecution, because Nero wasn't the last one. Nero was only the first one. The next one came in about 90 AD. And so John is writing about the time where there's another persecution from Rome, another emperor coming in to mess everything up and to hurt Christians. It was during that time that you had the Christians being fed to lions, things like that. But John writes, and John writes with a different perspective. He writes with a more heavenly perspective, a more eternal perspective. And so in John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31, we get an idea of what John's purpose was. Why did he write it? So John chapter 20, it's on page 1687 in our black books. And verses 30 and 31 say this. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So, what is John's purpose for writing? What does he want to see happen?
The rebirth of the people reading it.
The rebirth, the new life, that they may know that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Now that's not a throwaway. Don't ever throw away a descriptive for Jesus. It's important. The Christ means he's the anointed king. The Son of God, what does that mean?
He's
Equal with God.
Equal with God. So this, John is saying, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the anointed one, the king, which is spoken of in the Old Testament, the Son of God, the eternal Son, God, deity, same, equal as, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So it's evangelical, it's outreaching. John writes to the world. He doesn't write really to any one particular audience. He's writing to the world. What does John 3:16 say? For God so loved Jews?
the world.
Gentiles, poor people? No. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. That's John's whole thrust, is to prove that Jesus is the eternal Son of God, God in the flesh, and that believing in him, you'll have eternal life. You getting a feel for the Gospels now?
I'm still wondering why not just one that tells it all? Why four?
Well, I think it goes back to different audiences, different times. Different audiences and different times is the way you give it to them. Yes. Yes. So let's go back a little bit. Go back to Mark 1:1. All four Gospels introduce the centerpiece, this Jesus the Christ. They all introduce him. And we're going to start in Mark 1:1. We're going to hit just a couple verses and then we'll wrap it up. So Mark 1:1. And if you put all of these introductions together, you got a really good picture of Jesus. A really good picture of Jesus and where this is going. So John chapter 1 verse, Mark chapter 1 verse 1. Larry, can you read that for me?
Just first one.
Just the first verse.
The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God.
That's it. That's it, period. Very good. The beginning of the gospel, or good news, his translation already translated it into modern English, good news. Your NIVs would say gospel. So the beginning of the gospel, the good news, about whom?
Jesus.
About Jesus. Stop. Now we do this too often, I think. We say Jesus Christ as if Christ is his name. Like Matthew Robert, Susan Elaine. It's not a name, it's a title. It's like saying Obama president, John senator. Remember, what does Christ mean? The anointed one, the Messiah, the King, the one who Christ has appointed above all things, given all authority, all power, all dominion. Everything shall be under his feet. So, Mark starts in the beginning of this good news, this proclamation of God's plan about Jesus. Your translation says the Messiah. That's a better translation. I like that better because it distinguishes Jesus, who is the person, the man, from the Messiah, who is the one that is appointed by God. They are one and the same. This Jesus, this man Jesus, he is the Messiah. He is the anointed one of God. He is the one who all authority, all power, all dominion is given to him. He will rule with the iron scepter over all nations. That's who we're about to talk. That's the gospel we're going to start. This is the beginning of that gospel Mark starts out with. And then he adds the Son of God. Now, what is that about? We said this already. What's that mean? What is he implying? What is he talking about? If someone read the Son of God, what are they going to think of?
Sinless?
Power.
Holy.
Equal God to God.
Equal to God. There you go. That's all I want. That's right there. Let's start right there. Equal to God. Remember, we're speaking in a time where the Roman mythology and all that, and Greek mythology, the Zeuses and all that, what did they do? They came down, they mingled with the earthly women, and they produced these half God, half human people. Hercules was one of those, right? And you come up with all these weird stuff that pops up over time. This is not what he's saying. He's saying he is the one and only. There is no mingling. This is not Greek mythology. This is not Roman mythology. He is God. He is not part God, part man. He is fully God.
He's not a son of God, but
The Son of God. Yes, exactly. Exactly. So that we get with Mark. Well, there's two that two Old Testament. Right? We're tying into Old Testament. New Testament, we're just carrying it through. We saw the plan of God working through people. Jesus is now the final person who he's going to work this through. And we saw in Psalm chapter 2, we saw the anointed, the Christ, the Messiah, right? We saw, or the other one was be Son of God. That's also in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Do you remember David? Do you remember that? We read this last week. God tells David, I'm making a covenant with you. I want to make a covenant with you. And in that covenant, he says, your son, one of your seed, one of your heirs, will be on the throne, will be on my throne. And I will be a father to him, and he will be my son. And his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. It will be held as an everlasting kingdom because I'm the one that's going to be holding it. I'm the one that's going to control it. It is my kingdom. And I'm going to give it. So when Mark says Son of God, he's not only saying he is God, but he's also saying it fulfills prophecy. It fulfills that prophecy. So that's Mark. Flip back to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1. It's on page 1496. 1496. I'm not going to read this entire genealogy, so to speak, but I want to highlight it. Matthew chapter 1. Remember what I told you about Matthew? His purpose was to prove to Jews that Jesus is the King of the Jews. If he's King of the Jews, that means he has to be related to whom? David, and to... Has to be more than David.
Solomon?
God.
No, not Solomon.
Oh, Abraham.
Abraham.
Oh, that's right.
Remember, Genesis 12, Genesis 15, we learned that the seed to Abraham would be the one that God was going to bless. He was the seed. So, we have to see that. Was Jesus related? So, chapter 1, verse 1. A record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Ta-da! Starts with the first one. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, etc., etc., etc. You get down to verse 6. And Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was, you go on and on and on and on and on and on. You get to verse 12. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the Jeconiah, I'm going to mess this up, was the father of Shealtiel. Shealtiel was the father of, who's that guy? Who's Zerubbabel? We read about him too.
He was coming out of Median-Persian Empire to build.
Yes, very good, Larissa. Yes, he was the one that led the first exile. He came out of, and you go on and on and on and on. So Zerubbabel, blah 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 blah. Go down to verse, not blah blah blah. I got to get out of that. That's the first time I did. That's the first time I did that in a long, long, long time. All right. Anyway, you get down to verse 16, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Thus, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to Christ. Does Matthew put it all together? Yes, he does. Yes, ma'am.
Is Zerubbabel from Esther?
After Esther. No. Before Esther. Before Esther. Zerubbabel went back right after Daniel's time.
Why is he? I like his name.
He has a cool name. I like his name too.
I like his name.
So Jesus satisfies the Abrahamic covenant. He satisfies the Davidic covenant. When I say he satisfies it, what do I mean by that? Does that mean he throws it away? He throws those covenants that God made with David and God made with Abraham. Fulfills. What does that mean? Fulfills. Give me another word for that. Because we'd like to throw the Old Testament away. I don't want to throw the Old Testament away. This is the same of God's plan.
Followed them perfectly.
Followed them perfectly. He fulfilled. He satisfied them. That's the word I would like to use. Fulfill. Some people get lost with that word. He satisfied them. He met all of the requirements for those. God hasn't. With Jesus, he hasn't said, new plan. He has said, he fulfills my plan that I've had all along. He fulfills my plan through Abraham. He fulfilled my plan through David. This is my son, Jesus. Same plan. See, right here. It's all satisfied. He did it. In him, everything is satisfied. All of the requirements are met. So that's Matthew. Flip over to John. John is probably my favorite because like we were talking earlier, John is the spiritual gospel, the one that's very heavenly minded, very eternal. It shines a different side, the eternal side of Jesus Christ, God. So, whereas Matthew and Luke begin with Jesus' birth, John starts somewhere else. And it gives us a little different picture of Jesus. Who can read verse 1 and 2? Larissa, you want to read verses 1 and 2?
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning.
Go ahead and read 3.
Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made.
Okay, let's just stop right there, because that is, you could spend days going through that and unwrapping that. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning of what?
Is there any beginning with God? No. But it certainly takes us from the earth information of the other Gospels, talking about old kings and earthly history, and it just doesn't even go there. It goes right up to heaven, to the throne of God, and says, hello, here is God the Son.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. John, unlike the other three, begins in eternity past, before anything is created. The Word was a co-creator in this thing called creation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So they were there together, right? Before, mind you, how does Genesis begin?
In the beginning.
In the beginning, God, right? John starts, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. What is he referring to?
His son.
Where is he pulling this idea of in the beginning God from?
Jesus.
Genesis. In the beginning, God. Now, write that down in your head. In the beginning, ... God. Now, John is going to throw something right in the middle of that ellipses, right in the middle of that ... In the beginning, God. Well, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Are you starting to get it? John is taking Jesus, who he's going to equate with the Word here in a moment, and he is saying, I know you know the story, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. I understand you know that story, but I want to give you, there's a missing piece. There's a ... in between beginning and God. In between beginning and God, in the beginning God, there was the Word. He was with God. That time that you read about in the Old Testament in Genesis about the creation, there was a Word with God. He was God. And nothing that was ever made, that has ever been made, was not made, did not come into being unless it was through that Word. The Word was what brought it all into being. In the beginning, God. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Or through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has ever been made. Very good. Wow. I get a better picture of this Word, whoever this Word is. Flip over. Whew. Verse 14. Who can read for me verse 14? Phyllis, it's back to you.
The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth.
Very good. The Word became flesh. Oh, what do we call that?
Incarnation.
Incarnation. You know the word carne? Carn means meat or flesh. Incarnation, made in the flesh. So the Word, this Word, who was in the beginning, who was God, who was with God, who through him all things were made that were ever made, he became flesh. Oh, and he made his dwelling among us. He lived with us. He was real. He was real man. He wasn't a spirit. He wasn't a figment of your imagination. He wasn't a hologram. He was flesh. You could touch him, feel him, talk to him, eat with him. He was the Word. We saw his glory, the glory of the one and only. That's one and only begotten of the Father. He came from the Father. Oh, that's interesting. What does that imply?
Well, if he has father, then he is son.
That he's the Son, that he came from the Father. What does that mean? Or what does that tell you?
That he has father, and father sent him.
There you go. Now, if I sent you somewhere, why would I send you somewhere? Why do you think?
To do something
do-
for you.
To do something. I have a purpose. I have a plan. I want you to do something. I want you, Alina, to go in the other room and clean your room. What is my purpose in sending you? To go clean your room. That's what I want done. So, John says, the Word became flesh, He dwelt among us, and the Father sent Him. So, we have back to, remember what are our two things? The gospel is a proclamation announcement of God's plan, God's purpose, His goal, his what He wants to achieve in redemption through Jesus Christ, His only begotten Son. So John says the Father sent Him. Right? Okay? Now here's one that we tend to zoom right past, and it's important, I think. Full of grace and truth. That's very strange. What is important about grace and truth? You got to think about it for a little bit. What's going on at the time? What's happening? Why would grace and truth be two marks for this Messiah, this sent one, this Son that was sent?
A reflection of the Father.
Okay, so how does that fit with truth and grace? It's not holiness and happiness. It's not sadness and anything else. It's truth and grace. There's something about truth and grace that are very specific to Jesus. And you hinted at it already. You said he was a reflection of, or
He is a reflection of his Father, who is full of grace and is truth.
right.
He's gracious, he's kind. His message isn't, I'm coming here to get vengeance, like other gods' images are sometimes. I'm going to get even with all of you. It was a grace and truth message, which sounds a little kinder, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. How many people remember the story of the adulterous woman? The Pharisees and the people, the religious leaders catch this adulterous woman in the act. All right, where were you 2 minutes prior? But they catch her in the act. They drag her out in front of Jesus' feet, throw her at Jesus' feet, and they say, Rabbi, look, she's caught in the act of adultery. She should be stoned. Yes? What does he say? Famous line.
He who is without sin.
You know this one. Go ahead. You said it. Go ahead. It's a good one, Phyllis. Go ahead and say it.
I can't. I don't know.
In your own words.
Well, if you're without sin, then you cast the first stone.
Very good. You who think you're without sin, you who are without sin, who've never sinned before, you pick up the first stone and you go ahead and throw it. Go ahead. What do? Starting with the oldest and to the youngest, they did what?
Went away.
Their stones.
Dropped their stones and walked away, leaving the adulterous woman there. Now, Jesus, coming in truth and grace, what does he say to the woman?
Go and
Go
don't
and
sin.
sin no more.
What do you see in that comment?
Acknowledgement of the truth.
Acknowledgement of the truth. He doesn't say, you haven't sinned. He doesn't say, I don't know that you've sinned. He doesn't say that. He knows exactly what she's done. But he has grace. Go There's your grace. I've pardoned you. I forgive you. Go. I'm not going to stone you. That's what you deserve, but I'm not going to give that to you. I give you grace. Go. It's not deserved. It's love undeserved, favor undeserved. Sin no more. There's your truth. When Jesus is standing before Pilate, Pilate asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "Where did you hear that? Did they tell you that that's what it was?" And he brushes it off and he asks the question again, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "You've answered rightly. I am the king of the Jews. And for this purpose I've come into this world." In fact, I want to make sure I get it right, because that's a very, very important part. It's in chapter 18, if you want to write it down. Starting in verse 37, Pilate asks, "You are the king then?" said Pilate. And Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." So John focuses on this deliverer of truth. And Mom made the comment that Jesus reflected the Father, the character, the nature, the truth of God Father. Think about how messed up the people's perception of God was at the time when Jesus got around. By the time Jesus got around, you have Pharisees who believe that they are good enough, righteous enough, if they just do enough stuff, if they just plaster enough good stuff all over their, they wear those little boxes off of their foreheads with scriptures in it. They have the long tassels with the scriptures written. If I just wash my hands before I eat, if I just do this, do that, then I'm righteous enough. Yeah, exactly. They had a very, very messed up idea of who God was. Jesus comes to reveal them who the Father is. He came in truth. The truth about what? The truth about the Father. The truth about what really truly is. He said, "I am the truth." Right? He said, "I am the way, the truth, the life." But he came with grace as well. Oh, John's a good one. And then finally, the last one. Luke chapter 1. And we'll get more into all of these different characters later. Luke chapter 1. Here's Luke's introduction. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 1, Luke writes, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those whom from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." Why did Luke write the story of Luke? First of all, who was the primary person that he wrote to? Even though it was to poor people, but who did he write to? Theophilus. We have no idea who Theophilus was. There's nothing in the scripture record that tells us who he is. But Luke is writing to him on behalf of Theophilus, I suppose. What did it seem good for Luke to do?
To study everything carefully.
Study everything carefully. Remember, what is his profession? Doctor and historian. Historian. He's been following Paul around. And what is that last sentence, verse 4? Why did he write these things?
So that we may know the certainty of the things we've been taught.
Okay. Here is a historian, noted historian, people outside of the Bible who are not even Christian, other historians of his time, wrote about Luke. He writes and says, I write these things so that you will know the certainty of them. I'm writing this to you so that you will know this is not fable. This is not myth. This is not pretend. This is not a made-up story. These are historical, actual facts and events. And I want to put them, after careful investigation and careful study, I want to put them in order for you so that you will have a certainty. You'll know for sure that these things happened. The gospel that we believe, the gospel story that we proclaim, is historical fact. It is not a myth. It is one of the most verifiable stories in all of history. And Luke says, I'm writing it because I want you to have a historical record that's accurate. So now, we have a historical, factual life of Jesus Christ, who was the Word from eternity past, who was equal and is equal to God, made into the flesh, sent by the Father into the world, who is the Messiah, the King, the Son of God, who is bringing truth and grace for the redemption of mankind. To complete God's, or fulfill, to satisfy, to make, to work out God's, to finish God's plan to glorify himself. How many times in our gospel records did Jesus say, it's not about me, it's about the Father. I don't come to glorify myself, I come to glorify the Father. I don't come to do what I do, I don't do anything unless the Father tells me first. I don't do anything unless the Father tells me to go ahead and do it first. It's in the Father's timing, not my timing. Not my will, but thy will be done. How many times Jesus came to fulfill, satisfy, finish the work of God's plan of redemption, to make it happen. So you get to Hebrews chapter 1. And you don't have to go there. I'm just going to reference it because it's a good one to end today's lesson. So Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. That's what we saw, right? We saw that in the Old Testament. That's what we talked about earlier today.
Right.
But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. Sounds to me like what we've been talking about in the gospel so far. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. That's our Jesus. That's our Jesus. And that's the proclamation. That's the Gospels. That's what they're all about. The Gospels are a joyful, good news announcement, proclamation telling of the continued plan of God's redemption, redemptive work, through the eternal Son of God, Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the King, as expressed through 4 men: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's what the Gospels are. And that's, as we're going through, that's what we're going to pick up and see, is this plan of God being worked out through Jesus Christ through 4 different perspectives. Pretty cool, huh? All right, let's pray.